What did medieval executioners do when there were no executions? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world of cobbled streets, church bells, and very nervous criminals. A world where justice was slow, public, and usually sticky. We're going to medieval Europe, the land of gallows, headsmen, and the people who made a living keeping the rest of society terrified. But here's the thing. Even in the bloodiest centuries, executions didn't happen every day, and executioners, the men whose entire job was death, still had to pay rent, buy bread, and fill the long, silent days when nobody happened to be getting beheaded. So, tonight, we're asking a simple question. What did medieval executioners do when there were no executions? Settle in, dim the lights, and let's wander slowly through the quieter, stranger side of medieval justice. The side where the hangman was bored, broke, and probably drinking in the corner of his own infamy. Let's start with the obvious. Being an executioner wasn't exactly a dream job. You didn't grow up thinking, when I'm older, I'd like to decapitate people for a living. It wasn't a calling. It was a sentence. In most towns, the job went to someone no one else wanted around. A criminal whose punishment was commuted to lifelong service. A butcher's apprentice who knew his way around blades, or the unlucky son of an executioner. Because, yes, it was hereditary. Once your father took up the sword, the stigma passed down like a family curse. You might live comfortably, but you'd never live respectably. Executioners were tolerated, but never embraced. They were needed, but despised. They lived outside city walls, literally and socially. They couldn't join guilds. They couldn't attend church. They couldn't even drink at the same taverns as honest people. Which is saying something, since honesty wasn't exactly medieval Europe's strongest virtue. Their houses were often marked, painted red, or isolated near gallows hills. The message was clear. We need you, but we'd rather not look at you. And when there were no executions, they had to find other ways to survive. Let's drift now to a quiet morning in Nuremberg. Sometime in the 1500s, the town square is calm. No drums, no crowds, no heads rolling into baskets. The executioner, let's call him Franz, because statistically, that's likely, has woken early, out of habit. He sharpens his sword anyway. It's what he does every morning, rain or shine, justice or boredom. But there's no one scheduled for hanging today, so Franz has to do something else. Fortunately for him, the hangman's role came with extra responsibilities. You see, in many medieval towns, the executioner doubled as the city cleaner. He dealt with all the tasks no one else wanted, removing dead animals from the streets, cleaning cesspits and sewers, disposing of plague corpses, and, occasionally, testing new torture devices for the local authorities. Yes, he was essentially the municipal handyman of horror. When a horse dropped dead in the marketplace, people didn't call the blacksmith. They called the executioner. He'd show up, drag the carcass away, skin it for the leather, and bury or sell the rest. He also handled suicides, which, in medieval theology, were a problem. Suicide was considered a sin, and the bodies couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. So, guess who got the job? The executioner. He'd bury the body outside the city, usually at night, and sometimes drive a stake through the chest to pin the soul down. It wasn't superstition for him. It was Tuesday. Now, all that sounds grim, and it was, but it also paid. Executioners could make good money. Each death had a price. A hanging might earn a few silver coins. A beheading was more prestigious and more expensive. Breaking on the wheel, the most horrific of all punishments, was practically over time. But the rest of the time, when business was slow, they relied on side hustles. Franz, for example, might take up medicine, because, ironically, the town butcher was often its best doctor. Executioners had experience with anatomy. They knew where the arteries were, how to amputate, and how much blood a person could lose before fainting. And since no one else wanted to touch a bleeding patient, the hangman often became the town's unofficial surgeon. He'd lance boils, set bones, even perform crude surgeries, all while people swore they'd never speak to him socially. They wouldn't share a drink with him, but they'd absolutely let him sew their leg back on. In larger cities, executioners even had apprentices and assistants. They were called famuli, or, less elegantly, the hangman's boys. These young men learned how to sharpen swords, build scaffolds, and dispose of remains with minimal fuss. And if they stuck around long enough, they'd inherit the job, along with the town's collective disgust. There's a certain irony here. The executioner was both the most feared and the most useful person in town. He was the man you paid to kill, and the one you called when you wanted to live. Let's drift over to France for a moment, because of course the French turned execution into an art form. In Paris, the royal executioner was a celebrity of sorts. By the 1600s, he had an official title, Monsieur de Paris, and a whole staff. He wore fine clothes, kept detailed records, and received a generous salary from the crown. But when no one was scheduled to die, he too needed to fill the hours, so he dabbled in business. Many executioners ran tanneries, soap-making shops, or bone mills. Human remains were, disturbingly, part of the supply chain. Fat from executed criminals was rendered into medicine. Bones were sold for study or fertilizer, and in some cases, body parts were preserved and displayed as deterrents, a macabre form of public service. It's worth remembering that this was an era before the separation of trades. If you were good with knives, you might as well be good with soap. But for all the gruesome work, executioners had families, and those families faced their own strange existence. The children of executioners couldn't attend most schools. They weren't allowed to marry outside their caste, so they formed tight, insular communities. Hangman families marrying hangman families, generation after generation. In some places, they even had their own guilds. The Brotherhood of the Sword, equal parts. Mutual aid society and social quarantine, there's something quietly tragic about it. The very people who upheld the law lived outside it. Their lives were defined by other people's crimes, and when justice went quiet, so did their purpose. Yet, some found ways to thrive. Take Meister Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, a real historical figure, active from the 1570s to the early 1600s. He's one of the few executioners whose diary survives. And it's oddly serene. Over 45 years, Schmidt executed 394 people, which sounds horrifying, but he described each case in calm, clerical detail. He listed the name, the crime, the method, and the fee. No embellishment, no guilt, no pride, just precision. But here's the fascinating part. When he wasn't executing, he worked as a healer. He treated hundreds of patients, setting fractures, treating infections, prescribing herbs. He was respected for his skill, if not his company. By the end of his life, the City Council of Nuremberg actually pardoned him, restoring his family's honor. He retired peacefully, a respected citizen. Proof that even a hangman could, eventually, wash off the blood. Not every executioner had such luck. Many were alcoholics. Some went mad. Others simply disappeared between jobs, swallowed by the same society that had used and shunned them. The work took a toll, not just physically, though swinging a sword through bone isn't exactly gentle on the wrists, but mentally. You were the instrument of justice, but also its scapegoat. If an execution went poorly, say, if you botched a beheading and needed multiple swings, the crowd might riot. They blamed you, not the condemned. So, many executioners lived on the edge, feared by the living, haunted by the dead, and perpetually out of work. It's an odd kind of existence. The man everyone relies on when civilization wants to look civilized. And yet, there's something human beneath it all. Because on the days without executions, the hangman did what everyone else did. He mended tools. He fed his animals. He told stories to his children. He tried to live in a world that only wanted him when it needed to be. Cruel. Maybe that's the quiet truth of it. Even the darkest jobs have downtime, and even the executioner, between deaths, had to find ways to live. Let's drift a little deeper next, to the cities that tried to reform their executioners, to the strange friendships they formed, and to the places where the line between healer and killer blurred completely. By the 17th century, some executioners had even started to gain quiet respect, though no one would admit it publicly. In small towns, people would nod to them in the marketplace, buy their potions, send for them when a cow was sick. They still wouldn't sit beside them at church, but they'd slip coins into their hands afterward. A strange kind of truce. There's something deeply human about that hypocrisy, needing someone you can't stand to acknowledge. It's the same instinct that builds every civilization. Draw a line between clean and unclean, then step over it whenever it's convenient. And maybe that's why the hangman fascinates us so much now, because he lived at the edge of that line between justice and cruelty, faith and fear, death and healing. He was the person who made the system function, but who was never allowed to belong to it. When there were no patients, he sharpened blades. When there were no crimes, he waited for them to return, and in that quiet, there's something almost peaceful. What did medieval people think skeletons were doing underground? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a world before biology, before germ theory, before anyone thought to ask why the ground sometimes moved after a burial. A world where death was less of an ending and more of a mysterious administrative issue. So, dim the lights, pull up your blanket. Let's sink down into the quiet earth with our medieval ancestors and see what they thought the skeletons were up to beneath their feet. Spoiler: it was not resting peacefully. Because medieval Europe was full of theories about the dead, most of them terrible, a few mildly creative, and nearly all involving some kind of horrifying after-hours activity. They didn't think skeletons were just lying there. No, the popular opinion was that they were chewing, or whispering, or occasionally trying to claw their way back out. Let's start with the chewing part, which sounds ridiculous until you realize how seriously people took it. The chewing dead around. The 12th and 13th centuries, people across Central and Northern Europe began digging up graves. Not for treasure, not even for bones, but because of a new kind of undead panic. Reports circulated of bodies found in suspicious condition, shredded burial shrouds, gnawed fingertips, mouths full of blood. Obviously, people concluded the corpses were eating. In particular, they were believed to be chewing their own burial clothes. These were called Nachtzerer in German. Literally, after devourers. It was thought that once buried, certain unlucky souls, sinners, suicides, or people who died during plagues, would wake up underground and begin to consume themselves, or the fabric around them, one bite at a time. Naturally, this was bad news for everyone else, because the Nachtzerer weren't just hungry, they were contagious. You see, it wasn't enough for them to gnaw away quietly in the dirt. Every mouthful they took was believed to somehow drain the life from the living, usually their family members. So, if you buried Uncle Heinrich on Monday, and half your relatives started coughing by Friday, it was obvious what had happened. He was snacking. To cure this, medieval villagers did what any sensible community would do. They went to the cemetery at night with shovels. If the suspected Nachtzerer was found intact, bloated, and looking a little too pink, that was all the proof they needed. They would then decapitate the corpse, place a stone in its mouth, or, in a few enthusiastic cases, burn it, because of course they did. How did this idea start? The whole chewing corpse myth probably came from misunderstanding what happens during decomposition. As bodies rot, gases build up. The tongue can swell and push out. The jaw may move slightly, and blood-tinged fluids sometimes leak through the mouth. To a medieval grave digger that looked a lot like chewing at a torn shroud, maybe from insects, moisture, or rats, and suddenly you've got a solid case of undead textile consumption. Of course, the Nachtseher wasn't alone in Europe's restless afterlife lineup. Let's drift east for a moment to Poland, where they believed in something even more unsettling. The vampire of Drosko. Part 2. The Hungry Graves of Eastern Europe. In the early 2000s, archaeologists excavated a cemetery in Drosko, Poland, and found several burials that made absolutely no sense unless you were living in the 15th century and terrified of your dead neighbors. Some skeletons had sickles placed across their necks. Others had heavy stones pressed onto their throats or legs. One had a brick jammed firmly in its mouth. The explanation? Classic anti-vampire measures. These weren't modern vampires with slick hair and emotional baggage. They were decomposing peasants who, according to local folklore, refused to stay put. People genuinely thought the dead could crawl out of their graves and wander back home, not to bite necks, but to spread disease, spoil crops, and generally ruin everyone's week. It's worth noting that this fear spiked during plague years. If you buried someone, and then 3 days later your whole household fell ill, it made sense to assume they'd come back, invisibly, to finish the job. So, villagers developed creative solutions. They'd bury corpses face down, so if they woke up, they'd start digging the wrong way. They'd tie legs together with rope. They'd drive stakes through the chest, or, in a truly inspired move, they'd fill the corpse's mouth with bricks, because everyone knows you can't eat or chant curses with a brick wedged between your molars. Death as contagion, behind all these superstitions, was a deep, genuine fear. Death itself could spread. To the medieval mind, there was no firm boundary between body and soul, or between life and death. If something smelled foul, it wasn't decay. It was evil escaping. So when a corpse leaked fluid or exhaled gas, they thought it was releasing miasma, a deadly breath that drifted through the village and infected the living. That's why, during outbreaks, they sometimes dug up graves and burned bodies, not because they were cruel, but because they were desperate for control in a world that smelled like rot and punishment. And in fairness, the smell really was a problem. whispering bones. There was another strange belief floating through the medieval imagination. The idea that bones could talk, not literally chatter, though, to be honest, a few monks swore they heard that, but that bones remembered. In monasteries and churches, skulls were sometimes kept as relics. They weren't just bones. They were listeners. Some people would whisper prayers directly into the ear holes of skulls, believing the bones could carry messages to heaven, or to less favorable destinations. If you needed to curse someone, there's even a story from 13th century Germany about a man who confessed his sins to a skull and then claimed the jawbone moved to absolve him. Because, of course it did. Let's drift back west again, to England, where things were less about chewing corpses and more about making absolutely sure your dead relatives stayed where you put them. Part 3. England's overly enthusiastic burial practices. By the late Middle Ages, English churchyards were running out of space. Graves were reused, bodies were stacked, and occasionally bones just surfaced. When your village graveyard was also your shortcut to church, this was understandably disconcerting. People tripped over femurs. Children played with skulls. Dogs occasionally brought home something that wasn't a stick. So, burial customs became elaborate. Gravediggers were ordered to dig deep enough that bones wouldn't rise again. This wasn't just about sanitation. It was theological. People genuinely worried that the dead might get ideas. In 14th century London, one chronicler complained that corpses groaned at night. He didn't specify whether he meant ghosts or gases, but honestly, both options are unsettling. To stop the groaning, priests would bless the ground with holy water, sprinkle salt, and sometimes place iron nails in the coffin corners. A sort of divine padlock. Iron, you see, was thought to repel evil, and by extension, inconvenient movement. And yet, despite all the fear, there was also an odd tenderness in how medieval people treated bones. They dug them up for festivals. They cleaned them. They displayed them in glass. Bones were everywhere. In cathedrals, shrines, reliquaries. It wasn't exactly morbid. It was just practical theology. The body was temporary, the soul eternal. And if the body happened to resurface now and then, well, at least it was proof of something beyond decay. Let's pause here. And in the next part, we'll drift into what all this says about how medieval people saw death itself. Because beneath the shovels, the bricks, and the chewing accusations, there's a certain comfort, a belief that the dead were still part of the living world, inconveniently active, perhaps, but not entirely gone. And yet, the tower's dining culture persisted for centuries, a quiet ritual of survival and status. Chatiur, 17th century observer, described seeing 3 men share a table there I, nobleman eating roast meat from silver plates, a cleric eating beans from pewter, and a soldier gnawing bread straight from his hands. 3 ranks, 3 meals, 1 prison. It's an image that sums up the tower better than any execution could. A microcosm of English hierarchy, preserved in stone and soup. If you're wondering what prisoners drank, the answer is ale, always ale. Water was risky. The Thames, conveniently close, was also conveniently contaminated, so ale was the default beverage. Weak, cloudy, but at least unlikely to kill you immediately. The wealthy had wine, imported from France or Spain, served in heavy goblets. Some prisoners even petitioned for extra casks, arguing that illness made them unfit for small ale. The poor, meanwhile, drank whatever they were given, often so diluted that it barely qualified as liquid. And that, really, was the tower in miniature. Everyone ate, but not everyone dined. Food revealed your place in the hierarchy, your dignity, your guilt, and your worth to the crown. It could be comfort, it could be punishment, and sometimes it was both at once. By the 1920s and 30s, the once mighty eunuchs of the Qing dynasty were scattered across Beijing. Some became beggars, some opened tea houses. A few even gave interviews to Western journalists. Bemused, gentle old men who told stories of the Empress Dowager Cixi and the long corridors of the Forbidden City. One of them, Sun Yoting, lived until 1996. He had been castrated at the age of 8 in the early 1900s, when his father hoped he might one day serve the court. How did ancient people deal with boredom? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a quieter sort of question. Not about war or plague, or dynasties collapsing under the weight of their own cousins, but something far more universal, something deeply human. Boredom. That slow, soft, mind-numbing fog that settled over everyone from Babylonian scribes to medieval peasants. It's a strange thing to imagine, really. People from thousands of years ago sitting there staring at the wall, thinking, there's absolutely nothing to do. Because when we picture the past, we tend to fill it with noise and motion, battles, feasts, plagues, prophecies. But in between all that, there were hours upon hours of just nothing happening. And in a world without Netflix, social media, or the soothing hum of refrigerator white noise, what exactly did people do when life got unbearably dull? That's what we'll drift through tonight. The long stretches of ancient boredom. The strange, sometimes desperate ways people filled the void, and a few accidental inventions that came from it, usually by someone who was, frankly, just trying to kill time. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe pour yourself something medieval, like a weak ale or, well, probably just water. let's start our slow wander through time. The original ennui? We can begin, as we so often do, in Mesopotamia, humanity's favorite starting point for everything from agriculture to regrettable architecture. The Sumerians, living in their baked mud cities along the Tigris and Euphrates, were busy people. They built canals, invented writing, and accidentally discovered beer, which feels like the ancient equivalent of discovering both Microsoft Excel and Friday night. But when the crops were planted, the temples swept, and the tablets carved, the day still had hours to fill. So what did a Sumerian do with leisure time? Mostly, they played games. Archaeologists have found dozens of board games scratched into stone, grids and squares that look suspiciously like early versions of backgammon or checkers. The most famous is the royal game of Ur, a 5,000-year-old pastime that combines strategy, chance, and the ability to get unreasonably mad at someone for rolling the wrong number of dice. It's oddly comforting to think that humanity's oldest board game already captured the essential tension of every family. Holiday. One player leaning smugly forward while another mutters about bad luck. The Sumerians didn't write much about boredom itself. They were too practical for that. But you can sense it between the lines. The way scribes copied the same lines over and over, sometimes adding sarcastic little doodles in the margins. The way some tablets are full of jokes about lazy students and sluggish workers. One Sumerian schoolboy tablet from around 2000 BCE includes a line that says, "My teacher is tired of me," which, frankly, feels like the first recorded sign of classroom boredom. Egyptian downtime now. Let's float down the Nile, where the ancient Egyptians perfected the art of waiting. Everything in Egyptian life ran on cycles. The flooding of the river, the rising of the sun, the careful scheduling of festivals and funerals. So when the river flooded and the fields disappeared under water, farmers suddenly had a lot of spare time. This was known as the inundation season, when daily life slowed to a near stop. Farmers became part-time craftsmen, builders, and sometimes, as papyrus graffiti suggests, enthusiastic complainers. They played games too, Senet being the favorite, a board of 30 squares that represented the journey of the soul through the afterlife. It was part gambling, part existential metaphor, and part ancient Candyland. Pharaohs played it. Slaves played it. It was one of the few things that crossed class boundaries. The universal experience of killing time while pretending to be spiritually enlightened. When they weren't gaming, Egyptians filled hours with music, dancing, and what can only be described as heavy day drinking. Beer was considered safer than water, and a dull afternoon could easily slip into mild intoxication, which might explain some of the stranger wall art from the New Kingdom, period. There's also evidence that Egyptian workers carved graffiti in the pyramids while they were being built. Some are insults directed at rival work crews. Others are just names and jokes. My favorite, translated from an Old Kingdom site, simply reads, "We are drunk again," which, if you've ever worked construction in unbearable heat, sounds perfectly reasonable. So while ancient Egypt gave us monumental architecture and divine kingship, it also gave us something more relatable, the urge to write something stupid on a wall just to pass the time. Greek philosophy and public loitering, if the Egyptians perfected waiting. The Greeks turned boredom into an art form. They didn't call it boredom, that's a modern word, but they did talk about acedia, a sort of restless dissatisfaction, the feeling of having everything and yet finding it meaningless, which, incidentally, describes about half of the Athenian upper class. For ordinary Greeks, there were theaters, athletic games, and symposia, essentially long, wine-fueled conversations where people debated philosophy, politics, and occasionally who had the nicest sandals. For the very rich, time itself became a problem. You couldn't spend all day herding goats if you were a nobleman with slaves to do it for you. So they filled the hours with intellectual hobbies, geometry, music, or the noble sport of telling other people how to live. Socrates famously hung around the Athenian agora, talking at people who were just trying to buy groceries. Plato described him as a gadfly, which is Greek for that guy who won't stop cornering you near the olives. There's something deeply human about it. The endless talking, the leisurely pacing, the sense that meaning might be found in conversation, or at least in the fifth cup of wine. And yet, for all their supposed sophistication, the Greeks also indulged in simpler distractions, gambling with dice, attending plays, or, when things got really dull, starting small wars with their neighbors, because sometimes the only cure for ancient boredom was to conquer someone else's coastline. Roman leisure, organized idleness. By the time we reach Rome, boredom had gone mainstream. The Romans invented a word for it, tedium, from which we get tedium. And naturally, they made it political. A bored Roman wasn't just lazy. He was a social problem. An idle citizen was a potential rebel. So the empire offered distractions on a monumental scale. Bread and circuses, gladiators, chariot races, theatrical performances, public baths, the ancient equivalent of mass entertainment. A Roman could start the day with a bath, really a social hangout, grab lunch at a tavern, then head to the Colosseum to watch people get mauled by leopards. By modern standards, it sounds horrifying. By Roman standards, it was an average Tuesday. The poet Juvenal mocked this culture, saying that the people cared only for panem et circenses, bread and circuses, and would happily trade freedom for entertainment, which is a little rich, coming from someone who clearly never missed a day at the games. But underneath the blood and marble, there's something touching about it. The Romans were trying, in their own violent, excessive way to solve the same problem we all face: how to make time feel like it matters. Medieval monotony now. Let's drift forward a few centuries into the damp and drafty world of medieval Europe. Here, boredom wasn't just common, it was spiritual. Monks, isolated in their cloisters, described a sin called acedia, the noonday demon. It struck around midday. When the sun was high, the air was still, and prayer began to feel unbearable. Acedia made monks yawn, sigh, and stare at their manuscripts with despair. One described it as a weariness of the soul. But really, it sounds like the medieval version of scrolling your phone for no reason. Peasants, meanwhile, lived the opposite problem. Their days were so full of physical labor that boredom was a luxury. But during long winters or holy days when work was forbidden, even they had to find ways to fill the hours. There were games, dice, cards, wrestling, or, for the extremely ambitious, trying to ride a pig through the village. There were taverns, gossip, and music, and sometimes people just sat by the fire listening to stories. It's easy to romanticize that, to imagine the flicker of firelight, the quiet hum of voices, but mostly it was about surviving time itself, passing one more cold evening until the next sunrise. Let's drift for a moment on that image. 1,000 winters, 1,000 quiet nights, and humans in every century trying to outwait the silence. In the next part, we'll wander into the Renaissance and beyond to see how boredom, strangely enough, helped shape science, art, and the peculiar habits of people who simply had too much free time. In his old age, he became something like a living museum exhibit himself, the last of a vanished order, recounting memories of emperors no one had seen, and rituals no one performed. He once told an interviewer that he dreamed of the palace every night. The smell of sandalwood, the sound of bells, the sight of dawn light on the vermilion gates. And when he woke, he would sometimes forget that it was gone. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine devoting your entire life to a structure that suddenly stops existing, a world of hierarchies and rituals that evaporates overnight, and you, someone defined entirely by your place within that system, are left standing, unsure where to go. That was the eunuch's fate. They were servants of eternity. How dirty were medieval monks, really? Soap, sin, and the scent of salvation. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, to the quiet echo of cloister bells, the scratch of quills, and the faint, lingering smell of unwashed wool and holy intentions, because, tonight, we're asking a simple question with a surprisingly grim answer. How dirty were medieval monks, really? You've probably heard both extremes. Some people imagine them as spotless, saintly figures, gliding through marble baths, chanting through the steam, fragrant with lavender oil and divine purpose. Others picture them as hairy, mud-caked ascetics who hadn't seen a bar of soap since the Second Crusade. The truth, of course, is somewhere in the middle, and slightly worse than you're hoping, so settle in, dim the lights, and let's drift back through the cloisters and refectories, past the manuscript desks and herbal gardens, to peek into the most overlooked part of medieval monastic life, hygiene, or, as the monks themselves might have called it, a test of faith in bodily discomfort. The bathing paradox, it's easy to forget that. Monks were some of the few people in medieval Europe who could actually afford to be clean. Monasteries had running water, or something close to it. Many were built near rivers or springs, and over time, the cleverer orders constructed elaborate water channels that carried fresh water straight into the cloisters. At the Abbey of Cluny in France, the system was so advanced that by the 11th century, they had indoor plumbing, actual drains, a medieval miracle. So, yes, monks could wash. The question is whether they wanted to, because bathing was a moral gray area. On one hand, it was considered healthy, even necessary, especially for those living under vows of obedience and communal life. But on the other hand, cleanliness came dangerously close to vanity, and vanity, as everyone knew, was just sin in a prettier robe. Monastic rules varied wildly by order. The Benedictines, for example, were moderate. Their rule, written by Saint Benedict himself around the 6th century, advised balance in all things. So, monks were allowed to bathe when necessary. Necessary, in this case, meaning you are visibly crusting over. Later interpretations softened this slightly. The rule of Saint Benedict doesn't mention soap, but it does mention that monks should wash their hands regularly and take baths for the sick and the very dirty. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How dirty did you have to be before qualifying as very dirty? For the Cistercians, things got stricter. Founded in the 11th century as a reform movement, the Cistercians were like the minimalist cousins of the Benedictines, austere, practical, and firmly anti-luxury. They built beautiful monasteries in desolate, swampy areas, presumably because suffering built character, and they made sure no one was getting too comfortable. Baths were limited. Warm water was discouraged, and while they valued physical labor, they weren't too concerned with washing off afterward. So, you'd have a group of pale, disciplined men working in damp fields all day, sleeping in shared dormitories, and probably smelling like a damp parchment soaked in old cabbage. Then there were the Carthusians. If the Cistercians were strict, the Carthusians were downright alarming. They lived in near silence, ate almost nothing, and believed physical discomfort brought them closer to God. So, in the Carthusian charter house, bathing wasn't a weekly chore. It was a temptation. They did, however, allow limited washing on special feast days, or, in some cases, when lice infestations got too severe to ignore. Which brings us to the medieval monk's most constant companion, the louse. Lice, vermin, and the holy itch lice weren't just common. They were practically monastic mascots. In many monastic rules, itching was mentioned as part of daily life. Scratching wasn't frowned upon. It was practically inevitable. Some monks even referred to lice affectionately as God's pearls, which tells you everything about the medieval capacity for self-deception. When your scalp was a thriving ecosystem, you had two options: wash and risk vanity, or don't wash and call it piety. Most chose piety. There are reports of monks using communal combs to remove lice, though the hygiene standards of those combs are questionable. In the inventories of several monasteries, you find entries like one comb made of bone, shared by all brothers. One comb, for everyone. And yes, occasionally, someone wrote marginal notes complaining about it, which is how we know the practice existed. Because, of course, when your head itches, and your only relief is a shared lice comb, you might be tempted to jot a sarcastic line in the margin of your prayer book. Water, symbolism, and the sin of soap. You might think a monastery with its own water supply would have a bathhouse, and some did. But it wasn't like a Roman spa. In fact, when monks borrowed Roman baths and rebuilt them, they removed the heating systems first. Hot water, after all, was indulgent. The Cistercians, for instance, built ingenious water channels, not to make baths cozier, but to power mills and flush latrines. Cleanliness, yes. Comfort, no. And even where soap was used, it wasn't the perfumed, bubbly sort. Medieval soap was rough and gray, made from animal fat and lye. It was more of a mild punishment than a pleasure. The real irony is that monks actually bathed more than the E.T. average peasant, but felt guiltier about it. A farmer washing in the river after work wasn't showing off, but a monk soaking too long in a tub might be accused of pride. There's a letter from the 12th century in which one abbot scolds his monks for spending too much time in the bathhouse. Apparently, they were having needless conversations while washing, which in monastic language might as well mean flagrant orgy. So the abbot closed the baths temporarily to restore discipline. Nothing kills morale quite like being told you've been too cheerful while scrubbing your elbows. Laundry, linen, and the weekly shirt situation. If washing your body was tricky, washing your clothes was a whole separate theological dilemma. Under most rules, monks were allowed to change their undergarments once a week, though this was sometimes interpreted as once every 2 weeks by abbots who considered laundry a moral hazard. The logic was simple. If you wore the same shirt long enough, you'd stop caring about appearances. And, to be fair, that worked. Some monasteries had laundries and employed lay brothers, non-ordained servants, to handle washing. Others simply didn't bother. Imagine a dormitory of 40 men, each wearing the same rough linen tunic day and night, for weeks on end. Now imagine winter. Now imagine the smell, and remember, silence was mandatory, so no one could complain. Yet, despite all that, there was still a quiet pride in endurance. Monks genuinely believed that denying bodily comfort purified the soul. If you itched, sweated, or smelled, it was a small offering to God, a reminder that the body was fleeting and the spirit eternal. There's a record of one 13th century monk, Brother Udo, who was praised in his obituary for bearing his odor with patience. That was meant as a compliment. Let's drift a little deeper into this curious paradox, because beneath all the dirt, the lice and the cold baths, there's a logic to it. For medieval monks, filth wasn't just tolerated, it was a spiritual strategy. By the time Sun was old enough, the empire was gone. But he still spent years working for remnants of the old household, polishing relics, lighting incense, and remembering the days when emperors ruled from behind silk screens. When the last Chinese dynasty, the Qing, fell in 1912, the eunuchs were still there, still serving the young Emperor Puyi. Even after the abdication, when Puyi was allowed to remain in the Forbidden City as a sort of royal tenant, his household of eunuchs stayed on. For a while, life went on almost as before. They swept the courtyards, burned incense, and maintained the illusion that the empire still existed, just beyond the next courtyard wall. But as the years went by, the money ran out. The imperial treasures were gradually sold off, and the eunuchs, unpaid and unneeded, began to help themselves. They took vases, scrolls, silk robes, anything that could be traded for a meal. When guards discovered the thefts, many were dismissed. Others simply walked away, slipping out the palace gates into a world that had no idea what to do with them. What did people actually eat during the Black Death? A dinner invitation you'd rather decline. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the 14th century, to a world where the bells toll a little too often. The air smells faintly of vinegar and fear, and dinner time has become complicated. Because tonight's question is simple. What did people actually eat during the Black Death? It sounds like a strange thing to ask about a time when, well, So many people were dying. But in some ways, that's exactly what makes it fascinating. When half your town has vanished, your baker's gone, the miller's coughing blood, and your priest refuses to come near you without holding a stick of incense. What do you eat? What can you eat? So, tuck yourself in. Let's drift back through the plague years, through the empty markets, the desperate diets, and the odd culinary experiments of people who were just trying to stay alive, or at least die on a full stomach. The first thing to understand is that medieval Europe already had a complicated relationship with food. Even in good times, most people were walking a thin line between barely fed and mildly starving. So when the Black Death arrived in 1347, carried by ships from the east, packed with rats and their charming little fleas, it didn't hit a well-fed continent. It hit one that was already weak, tired, and perpetually hungry. And food wasn't just scarce. It was moralized. Everything you ate or didn't eat was seen as a reflection of your soul. Gluttony was a sin. So was waste. And luxury? Well, that was practically a prelude to hell. So people went into the plague years with a medieval diet that was both simple and, occasionally, punishable. The medieval menu, before the plague, before everything fell apart. The typical medieval diet was fairly predictable. If you were a peasant, you ate bread. Not the good kind. Not the fluffy, fragrant loaves you might be picturing, but something closer to a dense gray brick made from rye, oats, or whatever grain survived the last storm. You'd dip it in a thin vegetable soup, mostly cabbage, onions, and beans, and maybe, if you were lucky, a shred of salted pork. That was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. For the wealthy, meals were more exciting, at least visually. There were pies filled with pigeons, fish cooked in almond milk, and pastries dyed green with parsley juice. But even those dishes weren't necessarily delicious. Medieval seasoning was more about showing off than taste. They used saffron not because it was tasty, but because it was expensive. Spices were like edible status symbols. Still, plague or not, the basic rule held. Peasants ate what they could. Nobles ate what impressed people, and everyone pretended to like it. Then the death came. When the Black Death hit, the economy collapsed almost overnight. Markets emptied. Fields went untended. Flocks wandered off. And the few people still alive often refused to sell food. Not out of greed, but out of terror. They believed disease could spread through contact with infected goods. And since no one was sure whether plague came from the air, water, or the wrath of God, they decided it was safest to avoid everything. So, Food prices soared. In England, grain became so expensive that an entire year's wages could barely buy a few sacks. In parts of Italy, fruit rotted on trees because no one dared pick it. In short, people starved, surrounded by abundance. The plague diet in a world without doctors, or at least without useful ones, food became medicine. People genuinely believed that eating certain things could make them immune to plague, or at least less likely to drop dead in the street. The logic was based on the ancient Greek idea of humors, those four charming fluids that supposedly governed your health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The plague, doctors said, was caused by corruption of the air, which inflamed the humors and unbalanced the body. So naturally, the cure was diet. You were advised to eat things that cooled the body, meaning lettuce, cucumber, vinegar, and boiled vegetables. You were told to avoid heating foods: pork, garlic, wine, onions, and anything spicy. In other words, medieval people faced the world's most depressing salad cleanse. Doctors even published plague cookbooks. Genuinely, there were guides titled Regimen Contra Pestilentium. They recommended meals that were light, dry, and sour. For breakfast, you might have a small piece of dry bread dipped in vinegar. For dinner, boiled barley or lentils with a drizzle of rose water. And for dessert, perhaps, a brief cry. In Venice, physicians encouraged people to eat preserved lemons and acidic things to purify the blood. In France, doctors suggested chewing cloves and rinsing the mouth with wine. Not for pleasure, but to kill evil vapors. To modern ears, it sounds absurd, but to medieval people, it was science, the same kind of logic that led them to carry posies of herbs under their noses to filter the air. And really, who can blame them? When your friends are dying overnight, you'll try anything, even boiled lettuce. Garlic, vinegar, and emeralds, of course. Not everyone followed the medical advice. Folk remedies ran wild. Some people swore by raw garlic, eaten by the handful. Others drank vinegar in large doses, believing it could cut the plague miasma inside the body. There's even a recipe for a plague tonic made from ground. Emeralds mixed with wine. Yes, emeralds, as in the gemstone. It was ruinously expensive and completely useless. But for the wealthy, drinking powdered jewels was reassuring, a way of proving they could still afford something, even if it didn't help. Meanwhile, the poor were left with onions, leeks, and superstition. The monks' menu monasteries were hit hard by the plague. Communal living made infection almost inevitable. But for those who survived, food became both a ritual and a form of penance. Monks avoided meat, partly for religious reasons, partly because it spoiled quickly. Their diet centered on beans, bread, and ale. But during plague years, even that was disrupted. Lay brothers, the ones who cooked and farmed, often died first, so the monks were left to fend for themselves. Some monasteries recorded weeks of fasting, not out of devotion, but because there was simply nothing to eat. And when food did arrive, it was often grim. There's a surviving record from a Cistercian abbey listing cabbages, peas, and salted fish, all smelling of death, which, coincidentally, is also an accurate summary of the entire century. Peasant survival out in the countryside, things looked even bleaker. When neighbors died, their fields went wild. Farm animals wandered loose. In some villages, survivors scavenged whatever they could. Acorns, nettles, or even grass boiled into a thin, green soup. Chroniclers in Germany and Bohemia mention desperate people eating roots and bark, and a few stories, probably exaggerated, of cannibalism. But more often, starvation wasn't about lack of food, it was about fear. People abandoned entire villages, leaving granaries full because no one dared touch them. They believed the grain itself might carry death. So it rotted, and the smell of decay, human and otherwise, filled the air. Still, people are nothing if not adaptable. Some found ways to cope. In England, shepherds began salting and smoking meat in bulk, creating what might be considered early medieval jerky. In Italy, towns baked hardtack biscuits that could last for months without spoiling. And across Europe, vinegar became the go-to condiment, disinfectant, and probably perfume. People washed fruit in it, soaked bread in it, and, according to some accounts, drank it straight. Because if plague didn't kill you, the acid reflux might. A meal with death, one of the stranger customs to appear during the plague, was the idea of banquets of the dead. In certain regions of France and Germany, families began setting food out on the table after funerals for the deceased. It wasn't eaten, of course. It just sat there as a symbolic offering, or perhaps a peace gesture to whatever had taken them. These meals usually featured bread, salt, and wine. Simple, solemn, and entirely for show, but it's strangely touching. Even in a time when death was everywhere, people still found comfort in the small rituals of mealtime. They couldn't stop the dying, but they could at least share a loaf with memory. And somewhere, amid all the hunger and horror, a few people were actually eating better than ever, because as the population fell, food prices eventually dropped. By the 1350s, the surviving peasants could afford luxuries they'd never dreamed of. Meat, butter, even ale. It was the grim economic silver lining. Fewer mouths, more leftovers. So by the end of the Black Death, Europe was paradoxically well-fed, just not for the reasons anyone would want. Let's drift onward. In the next part, we'll wander through the plague kitchens of the rich and the desperate alike. We'll look at what the nobles served at their plague-safe banquets, how cooks adapted to shortages, and what people believed God wanted them to eat while the world fell apart. But eternity, as it turns out, has a surprisingly short shelf life. The leeches, the garlic, the goose fat, the anxious kings rubbing hedgehog ash into their foreheads. But beneath the humor is something strangely human. Because hair, for medieval people, wasn't vanity alone, it was identity. To lose it meant to lose a visible piece of who you were. And in a world obsessed with symbols, crowns, tonsures, veils, that loss carried weight. Even the most powerful people couldn't control it. Not with prayer, not with gold, not with pigeon excrement. How did medieval people go bald gracefully? Crowns, tonsures, and pigeons on your scalp. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when your hair wasn't just something you brushed in the morning. It was your social rank, your health status, and possibly your only defense against being mistaken for a monk. So, get comfortable, pull up a blanket, and let's wander into the mildly tragic world of medieval hair loss, where kings worried about thinning crowns, monks pretended it was fashionable, and physicians swore that pigeon droppings would bring your hair back within the fortnight. Because it turns out, medieval Europe was just as obsessed with hairlines as we are, only with worse lighting. To begin gently, hair meant a lot in the Middle Ages. For both men and women, it was a symbol of divine favor, of vitality, youth, and control. A full head of hair meant you were in balance, both physically and morally. Meanwhile, losing your hair could be seen as anything from a medical imbalance to a sign that God was making edits. It's a strange thing to imagine, but in a world before mirrors and shampoo, people spent an awful lot of time thinking about their hair. And when it began to disappear, patch by patch or strand by strand, they didn't take it quietly. Let's start with the obvious problem. Medieval medicine had no idea why anyone went bald. They had theories, of course. So many theories. Most of them came from the ancient Greek physician Galen, who explained that hair growth depended on heat and moisture. A healthy man, he said, should be warm and damp, but not too damp, or you risked growing mold, which was frowned upon. Too dry, however, and the hair simply failed to thrive. Baldness, therefore, was often blamed on excessive heat in the head, particularly in intelligent men, who supposedly burned up their natural moisture through thought. In short, if you were bald, it might just be because you were too clever, which, as excuses go, is about as elegant as they come. But if you were less philosophically inclined and more practical, medieval apothecaries were happy to help, for a fee. Remedies for baldness appeared in nearly every medieval medical text, from English herbals to Arabic pharmacopoeias, and they all had one thing in common: absolutely no chance of working. The Bald's Leech Book, a 10th century Anglo-Saxon medical manual, suggests boiling rosemary and nettles in wine, then rubbing the mixture vigorously upon the head until it bleedeth. The theory, apparently, was that a little bloodletting might wake up the sleepy follicles. Other recipes were more creative. In one, you were to mash up leeks, onions, and garlic, mix them with goose fat, and apply liberally to the scalp. The smell alone was enough to ensure that no one would mention your receding hairline. Across the Channel, medieval French physicians offered their own advice. A 14th century Parisian medical text recommends pigeon droppings. Specifically, those of a young pigeon, presumably because baby birds are fresher. You'd mix the droppings with vinegar and rub it on your scalp whilst reciting a psalm. It's unclear which psalm, but one suspects it didn't help. Meanwhile, in Italy, a physician named Matteo Silvatico swore by a blend of burnt hedgehog ashes and honey. Yes, hedgehog. You were to char the poor thing, grind it to powder, and smear it on your bald spot, because apparently nothing says self-care like animal cremation and despair. Still, people kept trying, because hair meant everything. For men, it was part of their social armor. Knights were meant to have thick manes that rippled out from under their helmets. Priests were meant to have neat tonsures, bald circles shaved into the crown, as a sign of humility. But if your hair fell out by itself, it wasn't humility. It was humiliation. The chronicles of the day are filled with snide little comments about appearance. Medieval scribes, it seems, couldn't resist noting when a king's hairline began to retreat, when William the Conqueror got heavier and balder. In middle age, chroniclers gleefully recorded that he grew large in body and small in hair, a perfectly medieval way of saying he let himself go. There was, however, one social group that turned baldness into a virtue: the clergy. Monks deliberately shaved their heads in the tonsure, a ritual circle of baldness that left a fringe of hair around the sides, a look sometimes compared to a halo, but more often to a medieval soup bowl. The idea was humility, to renounce vanity and reject worldly fashion. In practice, of course, it created a rather awkward dynamic, because plenty of monks were naturally bald before they ever picked up a razor. For those unfortunate souls, the hoe, tonsure was less a spiritual symbol and more a convenient disguise. It was the medieval equivalent of saying, "No, I meant to do that." Let's drift for a moment into the royal courts, where vanity was an occupational hazard. Kings and nobles, of course, could afford all sorts of hair care luxuries. Imported oils from the Mediterranean, combs carved from ivory or polished bone, even wigs, though not the elaborate powdered ones of later centuries. These were more like discreet patches or false curls. In the 13th century, some knights were known to wear false forelocks, little tufts of hair sewn into caps to make their foreheads look smaller, because a high forehead was seen as a sign of aging, or worse, of poor breeding. It's comforting, in a way, to know that even medieval men suffered from what we'd now call hairline anxiety. They just hid it under more velvet. For royal women, the situation was different, and in some ways, even stranger. In high medieval fashion, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries, noble women often plucked their hairlines on purpose. A smooth, high forehead was the height of beauty. So women would use tweezers, lime paste, or even hot cloths to remove the vitus, hair from the temples and brow, creating that serene, domed look you see in paintings of the era. In other words, women were deliberately creating the same look that men dreaded. It was, perhaps, the only time in medieval history when male and female beauty standards briefly met in the middle, just for entirely opposite reasons. Let's drift for a moment into the superstitions of baldness, because medieval people never left well enough alone. Everything had to have moral weight. Some theologians suggested that baldness was God's way of reminding men of their mortality. Others said it reflected a man's sins, the loss of spiritual covering through pride. But others took the opposite view, that baldness signified wisdom. After all, old men were bald, and old men were wise. The problem, of course, was that not everyone who went bald was old or wise. And there are records of young nobles praying, fasting, and even donating to monasteries in hopes that God might restore their hair. He rarely obliged. We can't talk about medieval baldness without mentioning the kings who refused to age gracefully. Let's start with Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, which, in hindsight, feels optimistic. Philip's portraits show him with an impeccable head of hair, glossy, golden, and arranged just so. But contemporary chroniclers noted that by his 40s, that famous mane had started thinning. Philip, being a king, and therefore incapable of moderation, immediately commissioned a range of tonics and treatments. One recipe involved soaking horsehair in wine for 3 days, and then rubbing the liquid into his scalp, because clearly that was how biology worked. He reportedly spent more time on hair regrowth than on his own children, which may explain why his sons became, quite frankly, disasters. But at least he looked, well, moisturized. Over in England, Henry III was said to be delicate of hair and easily sunburned, which sounds like a polite medieval way of saying ginger and balding. Chroniclers remarked that his crown had to be padded to fit, as the royal hair beneath it had departed early. Henry didn't mind, apparently. He embraced his hair loss as a mark of piety, though it's easy to be philosophical when you can just commission flattering portraits. Meanwhile, his grandson, Edward II, tried to avoid baldness by sleeping with his head covered in cold lettuce leaves, a remedy which, astonishingly, did not help. Now, if you were unfortunate enough to go bald but lacked royal funds, there were still affordable options. In the 15th century, apothecaries sold bottled miracle oils, usually a mix of goose fat, rosemary, and something vaguely toxic, like lead oxide or mercury. Users were told to rub the mixture into the scalp nightly while saying a prayer to Saint Mary Magdalene, who, for reasons unclear, was thought to intercede in follicular matters. It's not known whether anyone's hair grew back, but it's quite likely they glowed faintly in candlelight. And yet, for all the potions and pigeon droppings, some men simply decided to accept their fate, or at least pretend to. By the late Middle Ages, baldness began to acquire a certain dignity. Writers like Geoffrey Chaucer described bald men, often monks or clerics, as shining like a mirror. That's shining like a mirror, which is both descriptive and unkind. The bald man became a stock character in literature. The wise abbot, the comic steward, the aging knight, still insisting he was in his prime. Baldness was not admirable, but it was forgivable, a sign of time's passage and, occasionally, God's will. It's easy to smile at all this now, and maybe that's why baldness mattered so much, because it was one of the few things that reminded medieval people that underneath the robes and crowns, they were still just human. What happened to the eunuchs? After empires fell, the last voice in the Hall of Silks. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter, stranger corner of history. The moment after the curtain falls, after the emperors have died, after the harems are emptied, after the marble corridors echo with only the sound of dust settling, because someone was left behind. Someone always is. And in this story, it's the eunuchs, the men who once ruled behind the throne, who carried the secrets of empires, and then, one day, found themselves entirely obsolete. So, settle in, dim the lights, get comfortable. We're going to float through the fading centuries. From Byzantium's last whispering courtiers to the forgotten servants of the Ottoman Topkapi, to the final Chinese eunuchs selling stories to tourists in the 20th century. And along the way, we'll find that history doesn't always end with a bang. Sometimes it just trails off with an awkward cough and a polite bow. Let's start where all good imperial tragedies begin. In Byzantium, for nearly 1,000 years, eunuchs were everywhere in the Byzantine court. They were chamberlains, diplomats, generals, and sometimes saints, or at least as saintly as someone could be, while embezzling state funds and plotting succession coups. They were men, technically, without heirs, without wives, and, according to the official moral logic of the time, without temptation, which made them, of course, perfectly trustworthy servants for emperors who trusted no one. That's how eunuchs ended up running the empire's machinery from the shadows. They were the people who knew the emperor's schedule, who managed the treasury, who whispered advice in the candle-lit halls. And for centuries, that worked beautifully. The emperors came and went, but the eunuchs remained. Always there, always slightly unnerving, always impeccably dressed in silks that were, frankly, too nice for their pay grade. But what happens when the empire falls? Well, that's where the story turns quiet. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the world of the Byzantine eunuch came to a very abrupt stop. The empire that had sustained them for centuries simply ceased to exist, replaced overnight by an entirely different order. The surviving eunuchs, stripped of their titles and pay, suddenly found themselves as men without purpose. Some tried to blend into the new Ottoman bureaucracy, where eunuchs also played a powerful role. But for most Byzantine eunuchs, that was a closed world. The Ottomans already had their own systems, their own harems, their own hierarchy of carefully castrated administrators. The old Byzantine eunuchs, often Greek-speaking, Christian, and visibly aging, were simply not in demand. A few entered monasteries, because where else do you go when you've already renounced half the body and most of the world? Others became tutors or scribes, and some, poignantly, just disappeared from the record altogether. Men without descendants, without family names to carry them forward. It's a haunting kind of extinction. Not sudden, but soft, like a candle burning itself out in an empty chapel. Let's drift a bit east, because the Byzantine eunuchs weren't the only ones whose world collapsed under new empires across the desert. In the palaces of Baghdad, eunuchs had once managed the entire Abbasid Caliphate. They guarded harems, handled correspondence, and were trusted more than generals. And when the Mongols came, in 1258, with fire and rather unpleasant efficiency, those eunuchs faced a familiar problem. What happens when the walls fall? The records suggest some were executed, others enslaved by the conquerors, and a few, ever the survivors, managed to switch sides. After all, a good eunuch was hard to find, even in the Mongol Empire. They had skills. They could read. They could organize a court. They knew which side of the royal seal faced up, which, in medieval bureaucracy, was no small feat. But even those who survived became relics in their own time. Leftovers from a world of velvet intrigue and perfumed halls, now ruled by horsemen who thought silk robes were a bit too fussy. Eunuchs are strange in historical memory. They were simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. We read about them constantly, and yet we never hear from them directly. They left no heirs, no personal memoirs, and almost no gravestones. When they disappear from the records, it's not dramatic. They just fade out mid-sentence, like someone walked out of the room and never came back. So, to follow them, we have to trace the shadows. Let's pause for a moment on what it actually meant to be a eunuch. Because it's easy to reduce it to the physical aspect, the castration, but that was only the beginning. In most empires, eunuchs occupied a liminal space. They weren't fully men in the traditional sense, but they weren't women either. They were considered neutral, an in-between category that could move freely between male and female spaces. That's how they ended up as trusted intermediaries between emperors and harems. They could enter the private quarters without scandal. They could deliver messages from wives to husbands without being suspected of anything except, perhaps, excessive politeness. But that same neutrality came at a cost. They lived lives apart, neither patriarchs nor sons, neither husbands nor fathers. And when the empire fell, and family lines and patronage systems collapsed, the eunuchs had nothing to fall back on, no estates, no kin, no sons to light candles in their memory, just a name in a dusty ledger, if that. Now, if we float forward in time and a bit east again, we arrive in the Ottoman Empire, where eunuchs not only survived but positively thrived. The Ottomans perfected the art of palace hierarchy, and eunuchs were its silent engineers. There were two main types: black eunuchs, usually taken from Africa and placed in charge of the imperial harem, and white eunuchs, often from the Balkans or the Caucasus, who managed the education of princes and ran much of the inner bureaucracy. Their leader, the chief black eunuch, or Kislar Aga, was one of the most powerful men in the empire. He had direct access to the Sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, who often wielded more real power than her son. Together, they were a formidable duo, managing palace politics while everyone else politely pretended not to notice. It was, in many ways, a golden age for eunuchs. They built mosques, endowed charities, and amassed fortunes. The Ottoman archives are full of their signatures on property deeds and legal waqf documents. but even golden ages end. And when they did, they ended slowly, not with revolution, but with irrelevance. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was modernizing, or at least trying to. New bureaucratic reforms reduced the influence of the palace household. Westernized education systems and ministries took over much of what eunuchs had once managed. And the harem, that vast, cloistered world that had required hundreds of eunuchs to guard and maintain, began to dissolve. The real turning point came with the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, when the constitutionalists curtailed the power of the Sultan's household. From then on, eunuchs were largely ornamental. Their role became ceremonial, their pay dwindled, and their presence increasingly anachronistic, like wearing brocade robes to a telegraph office. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman palace had become a museum of sorts, and its eunuchs, living exhibits. One of the last recorded Ottoman eunuchs was a man named Habib Aga, who lived into the 1930s. He had served in the Topkapi Palace before it was turned into a museum, and when the Republic was founded, he simply stayed on, guarding the relics of a vanished world. Visitors described him as dignified, quiet, and deeply lonely. He spent his final years sitting in the palace gardens, feeding the peacocks, and occasionally telling curious guests about the old days, when he had carried messages between the Sultan and the Valide Sultan, when the air smelled of rose water, and when everything still seemed eternal. When he died, there was no funeral procession, no descendants, just a line in the municipal records, marking the passing of the last guardian of a vanished order. Let's drift even further east now, to the great imperial palaces of China. Because if the Ottomans gave eunuchs wealth, and Byzantium gave them power, China gave them longevity. The Chinese imperial eunuch system lasted for over 2,000 years, longer than most civilizations managed to exist at all. It began in the Zhou dynasty, around 1000 BCE, and lasted all the way to the early 20th century. For generation after generation, the eunuchs of the Forbidden City were the empire's hidden machinery, controlling the inner court, the household, and sometimes the emperor himself. And, as usual, they were both indispensable and despised. Chinese history is full of warnings about eunuchs. Every dynasty seemed to have one infamous example: the evil eunuch, who gained too much influence, corrupted the court, and brought ruin upon everyone. There was Zhao Gao, who manipulated the Qin emperor and plunged China into chaos in 207 BCE. Then Wei Zhongxian, in the Ming dynasty, who was so powerful that temples were built in his honor, until he fell, quite literally, from grace and was forced to hang himself. The Confucian scholars loathed eunuchs, seeing them as unbalanced creatures who disrupted the moral order. But emperors kept them anyway, because who else could they trust? Family members plotted, ministers rebelled, but eunuchs were loyal, or at least dependent, and that was good enough. Welcome to Dinner in the Dungeon. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to one of the most famous buildings in England. A place of coronations and coroners, lions and ghosts, queens and heads that rolled just a little too neatly. The Tower of London. It's been many things: a royal palace, a mint, an armory, and, most famously, a prison. But tonight, we're not talking about executions or escapes or royal intrigue. We're talking about something far more quietly miserable. Dinner. Because, for almost 1,000 years, the Tower's prisoners have eaten some of the most symbolically revealing meals in all of English history. From noblemen with entire kitchens at their disposal, to anonymous men chained to the wall with a cup of water and whatever the rats left behind. So, dim the lights. Settle in, and let's drift back through the centuries, plate by plate, through the curious and sometimes surprisingly gourmet history of eating in captivity. When you imagine a medieval dungeon, you probably picture something damp, dark, and miserable. Chains on the wall. Bread so stale it could be used as a weapon. Maybe a single candle flickering beside a bowl of thin soup that looks suspiciously like water someone else already used. And yes, that existed. For the unlucky, the forgotten, or the deliberately starved, the Tower could be precisely that. But not for everyone. You see, the Tower of London wasn't an ordinary prison. It was a royal prison, which meant your diet depended entirely on who you were, how important your head was, and how much your friends were willing to pay for your dinner. It wasn't one prison so much as several stacked on top of each other. A vertical hierarchy of misery, from feasting nobles in high chambers to starving commoners in the cells below. Let's start at the top, literally. The Tower's most famous and high-ranking prisoners were lodged in places like the Bell Tower or the Beauchamp Tower, often with servants, furniture, and, crucially, a meal allowance from the crown. These weren't cells so much as temporary apartments with bad views. If you were a nobleman or a bishop, you could bring your own chef, your own wine, and your own silverware. The crown would even issue you an official food budget called a diet, drawn from the royal accounts. It's where we get the phrase state diet, meaning the state is paying for your food, and for the right prisoner, the state paid handsomely. Take Sir Thomas More, imprisoned in the Tower in 1534 for politely refusing to acknowledge Henry VIII's marital rearrangements. More was given a reasonably comfortable cell and a food allowance fit for his former office as Lord Chancellor. He dined on meat pies, roast fowl, and bread, though not in abundance, and often under protest. He later joked that the king's good meat could not tempt him to treason, even if it came with pudding. His meals were probably brought by his daughter Margaret, who was permitted to visit him and bring gifts of food. A rare kindness, though one that didn't last. When his money ran out and the royal allowance was revoked, More's diet became simpler. Bread, water, and quiet contemplation until the contemplation turned terminal. Contrast that with Anne Boleyn, who arrived in 1536 as both a prisoner and, briefly, still a queen. She was housed in royal apartments and waited on by her own ladies. Her meals, according to accounts, included fresh fish, game birds, and delicate pastries. For the first few days, she even ate from gold plates, which must have felt comforting, if one ignored what the gold plates were foreshadowing. She tried to keep her spirits up, joking that she would soon be known as Queen Lackhead. Her appetite, reportedly, came and went, a detail her jailers noted with bureaucratic efficiency. And then, as her trial approached, her menus grew simpler. The Tower's kitchen records show that her meals were moderate, perhaps intentionally symbolic. Nothing extravagant, just enough to suggest dignity and restraint. A last royal supper before silence. Now, if you weren't royal but still inconveniently well-bred, your Tower diet was all about negotiation. Prisoners of rank could buy better meals. The Tower's wardens, known as the Lieutenant of the Tower and his staff, ran a sort of catering service. They charged prisoners for extra bread, better wine, more candles, or, occasionally, for the privilege of not having rats in the stew. Some prisoners spent small fortunes improving their diets. When the Jesuit priest Henry Walpole was held in the 1590s, his family sent him baskets of food daily. Roast meats, bread, and fruit. The guards naturally sampled the contents, a polite term for eating half of it. By contrast, less fortunate prisoners survived on the standard Tower ration: coarse brown bread, a jug of weak ale, and a ladle of pottage, a vague vegetable mush whose main ingredient was disappointment. Let's talk about pottage for a moment. If you've ever eaten porridge, imagine that, but sadder. Pottage was the universal medieval meal. It was a thick stew of grains, beans, and vegetables, boiled endlessly until everything surrendered. Sometimes it had meat in it, small, unidentifiable bits. Sometimes not. The Tower's kitchens produced vats of it daily, ladled into wooden bowls and distributed according to status. High-ranking prisoners got richer pottage with barley or chicken stock. Ordinary prisoners got something grayer, often flavored with salt and regret. Still, it was warm, filling, and easy to stretch. Perfect for a castle designed to hold both dukes and debtors. For the poorest prisoners, thieves, spies, common soldiers, food wasn't guaranteed at all. They were expected to beg for sustenance from guards, from visitors, from anyone willing to throw a coin or crust through the bars. It was called living by charity, which sounds poetic, but really meant starvation with extra steps. In some cases, prisoners were deliberately left to starve. One chronicler, writing in the 13th century, described a political prisoner named Ranulph Flambard, who survived only because his friends smuggled food to him in a wine cask. It worked so well that he eventually hid inside the cask himself and escaped, a rare example of a meal leading to freedom. Now, the tower's kitchens themselves were impressive. You can still see the remnants today. Massive stone hearths built to feed dozens at once. But the food wasn't cooked there for prisoners. It was cooked for the yeoman warders, the guards, and the royal garrison. Prisoners' meals were usually prepared elsewhere and brought in, often cold, often late. Still, some lucky captives could hire their own cooks. In the Tudor period, nobles under house arrest were permitted personal servants who cooked in small adjoining rooms. Imagine, if you will, being imprisoned but still complaining about the quality of the sauce. It happened, frequently. Let's drift for a moment to one of the tower's more curious cases, Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days' Queen, when she was Sahares. Imprisoned in 1553 after her extremely short reign, Jane was kept under relatively gentle conditions. She was given books, attendance, and a modest allowance for food. Her meals were vegetarian by choice, unusual at the time. She preferred simple fare, fruit, bread, and milk. Her jailers even noted her godly abstinence, which was polite shorthand for, "We offered her meat, and she said no." It's easy to romanticize that restraint. A doomed teenager quietly praying over her bread and water. But it also speaks to how controlled life in the tower could be. Even your diet became a performance, a statement of faith or loyalty or resignation. Not everyone took it so gracefully. When Sir Walter Raleigh was imprisoned in the early 1600s, he turned his cell into a laboratory, and his dining table into a chemistry bench. Raleigh was allowed servants, books, and, most dangerously, ingredients. He experimented with herbs, minerals, and recipes. He brewed elixirs, distilled alcohol, and occasionally poisoned himself slightly in the process. His meals were elaborate. He kept wine, imported fruit, and spices, luxuries far beyond most prisoners' dreams. He even entertained guests, including his wife, in what visitors described as a gentleman's lodging. It's safe to say that if you have time to serve pigeon pie and discuss alchemy, Your imprisonment is more philosophical than physical. For other prisoners, though, food was just another method of control. Henry VIII's minister, Thomas Cromwell, for instance, was granted no feasts in the Tower. His meals were plain and infrequent, just enough to keep him alive for trial. Even then, the record notes that his last meal was eaten with small appetite. Understandable, given the morning's itinerary. The symbolism was deliberate. To feed someone richly before execution was to acknowledge their dignity. To feed them poorly was to strip it away. In the Tower, dinner was never just dinner. It was a message. Let's pause on something rarely discussed. What the Tower smelled like, because all this food, the pottage, the roasts, the ale, was prepared in an enclosed fortress that also served as a garrison, a mint, and a menagerie. By the 13th century, lions and bears were kept near the outer walls. The stench of animal pens mixed with cooking fires, sewage channels, and river mud. Meals, no matter how fine, arrived perfumed with the faint odor of captivity. Even the noble prisoners complained. One French count, held in the 1300s, wrote that his food tasted of the Thames. He was not being poetic.